Hello everyone, I'm Samyukta, Assistant Professor of English. Today we will look into the topic of postmodernism and its influence in the American literature. So in this video, we will try to cover all these points. That is, a short introduction on postmodernism, and then we will look into the history of postmodernism, that is, how postmodernism arose from modernism, and then we will also look at some of the important postmodernists of the 20th century and how postmodernism has created a huge impact on the American literary trend of the latter half of the 20th century. So, first of all, postmodernism does not have a clear cut definition. So, it is basically an idea that draws in retaliation against the widespread concept of modernism roughly in the mid 20th century. So, postmodernism per se is difficult to describe and understand as it is a very abstract concept with multifarious meanings and approaches to literature. So, most importantly, in order to understand postmodernism better, we need to have a clear idea of what is meant by modernism. So, modernism is basically a style or movement that departs significantly from the classical or traditional forms of literature, and postmodernism rose in prominence at the end of the 20th century. So, before the rise of postmodernism, modernism was at its peak. What the early modernists believed in was that the world was a good place and its reality can only be understood by the human mind, and there is a system of fixed laws for everything. So, these were the things that the early modernists believed in. And in the 18th century, Isaac Newton and also some of the other scientists of the time increased the application of rational thinking to the world around them. So, this led to the rise of science and other findings. The modernists believed this to be the true reflection of reality. That is, science and its findings were considered to be true reflections of reality. And so in the 19th century, we have two important philosophers, Auguste Comte and Herbert Spencer. So, what these two men did was they extended the scientific approach into the realm of human society. And thus, this resulted in the development of social sciences. So, the modern frame of mind believed discoveries of natural and social sciences provided human beings with the truth. And this truth, beyond doubt by human understandings, it mirrored reality as it existed. So, this discovery of truth brought about by the rise in science and technology and the various other different studies carried out by social sciences in the modern period led the people to believe that they could control their world. That is, people began to believe that there was nothing beyond the control of man. And it also led them to believe that they can overcome any limitations and promising them that anything is possible in the world. And finally, and most importantly, modernism also promised people that they can eradicate destructive evils that plague mankind. That is, the diseases and other illnesses that were plaguing mankind, like how it is happening now. So it has also led people to believe that any form of disease or plague can also be eradicated by simply believing in the scientific truth that modernism was providing them. But a couple of centuries into the modern period, people started to realize the real truth behind modernism because modernism was beginning to fail in its promise at various levels. First of all, the science and technology which people believed hugely brought about environmental degradation, that is, ozone depletion, the emission of carbon monoxides, and all these problems were beginning to surface. And next, the development of a totalitarian society. That is, a system of government that is centralized and dictatorial and requires complete subservience from the people to the state. So, this kind of totalitarianism was not accepted by the people. And finally, the most crucial point is the global wars with atomic potential. Two world wars had happened in the modern period. So people finally realized that reason and science did not lead to utopia. So, as people began to understand these truths, then came the many reactions against modernism. And the two most important reaction against modernism was the despair of existentialism and postmodernism. We look at existentialism in detail later, but first let us look at what postmodernism is. So, as it was already said, postmodernism in large part is clearly the rejection of the modern view of things. And it does not hold a unified worldview because various proponents set forth their own theories and they in turn contradicted the postmodern ideas. So, in spite of their differences, postmodernists were united in their rejection of modernism. So, that was their one unifying point, that is the rejection of modernism. So, postmodernism was not concerned only in the literary circle alone. It was also developing in the fields of philosophy, films, architecture, art, and culture. And its only focus was to contradict postmodernism at any level. So, next, we have a few differences between modernism and postmodernism. So it is clearly distinguished and very easy for us to understand by simply looking at this chart here. So, where the modernists adhere to the Western hegemonic values, postmodernists contested it. And the modern way is always focused on the writer, but in the postmodern writing, the focus is on the reader. So, such contradictory ideas constructed postmodernism as it is today. So, here we have different ways of looking at the modern and postmodern period. That is, this pre modern period is where people were devoted to theology and they believed that anything that existed is because of God's potential. And then came the modern period and the discovery of the Big Bang Theory and all the other scientific discoveries expanded the knowledge of human beings beyond anyone could imagine. We were advancing at a rapid pace. And then the postmodern period. And this period contradicted everything that was said earlier. Everything had to be questioned and scrutinized. Nothing became simple anymore in the postmodern period. And this postmodern period set forth a new era, a new understanding in all of the art forms. And next, we have how postmodernism has influenced literature, specifically American literature. So, postmodern literature focused on advances in technology from a pessimistic view. And it also displayed greater diversity of culture that leads to cultural pluralism or multiculturalism. So, America as a country was at this point of time open to the world, and people from all across the world were traveling to America and making America their home. So, the United States became a hotspot where a plethora of cultures were coming together. And such a multicultural attitude was also reflected in the postmodernist literature of that time. And further, postmodernist literature also reconceptualizes the society and history. And now we have a few more points distinguishing modernist and postmodernist literature. So, first, a short definition of both kinds of literature, and then the focus. For modernism, the focus is on the inner self. It was very subjective, whereas in the postmodernist literature, the focus was multifarious. The meaning does not rely on a single thing. And then the technique. Most modernist literature focuses on fragmentation, unreliable narrator, disparity, dark humor, and paradox. All of these things were influenced by the discoveries of science during that time, whereas the postmodernist literature was more psychoanalytical in nature, focusing on the techniques such as stream of consciousness, irony, and satire. And the modernist style of writing, it deliberately broke away from the traditional forms, whereas the postmodernist style always conformed to the traditional and classical styles of writing. And finally, we have a few authors who wrote in the modern period and some who wrote in the postmodern period. Next, we have this famous quote by Harold Pinter. There are no hard distinctions between what is real and what is unreal, nor between what is true and what is false. A thing is not necessarily either true or false, it can be both true and false. So, this quote can sure be very confusing. It sounds more like the pictorial representation we saw of the postmodernist period in the previous slide. But on a serious note, this is how postmodernism was viewed at during that time. It was very abstract and difficult to understand. So, moving on now, we have some of the important postmodernists. So, the first one is David Hume. So, David Hume, he is a Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, historian, economist, and essayist. And he is well known for his empiricism, skepticism, and naturalism. Empiricism focused on the belief that knowledge existed only through sensory experience. And then skepticism, it focused on the denial of possibility of all knowledge and also the denial of certainty in knowledge due to the lack of proper evidence. And finally, naturalism, as the term denotes, believed in the natural laws and natural elements. So, David Hume was a proponent in all these forms of beliefs, and he also believed that passion rather than reason governs human behavior. And David Hume was hugely influenced by another philosopher called Immanuel Kant. But he also contradicted some of Kant's views when he questioned the human ability to truly know the external world. So, the next two postmodern writers are Immanuel Kant and Frederick Nietzsche. So, Immanuel Kant was the person who influenced David Hume widely, and Kant is a German philosopher, and his views on postmodernism had a crucial influence in the fields of epistemology, political theory, and postmodern aesthetics. Kant actually wanted to put an end to the era of writing speculative theories on human experience. He resisted the skepticism of some of the thinkers like David Hume, and he also tried to answer Hume's philosophy that human mind really cannot know things in themselves, but they only interpret external reality based on the mental categories that are already present in the human mind. So, this is what Immanuel Kant actually believed in. And then we have the next philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche. He is also a German philosopher, philologist, poet, and so on. And his works had a profound influence on modern intellectual history. So, according to Nietzsche, there is no foundation to rest your beliefs on. He believed that there is absolutely nothing out there to base our beliefs in. So, according to him, truth is dead, and thus people need to create their own worlds. And knowledge was merely a human construction. Knowledge was a false entity to Nietzsche. And there is nothing as knowledge that exists outside of human understanding. And so Nietzsche's ideas are central to postmodernism. Although he lived a century before his ideas became mainstream in postmodern literature. So, apart from the ideas of Kant and Nietzsche, the ideas of two other philosophical movements have been specifically influential in postmodernism. So, these two movements are, the first one is Pragmatism. So, Pragmatism began in the United States around 1870s, and it mainly stresses the importance of practicality over theory. And it also focused on how knowledge is only temporary, that is, how knowledge was provisional. It was not permanent but only temporary. It also rejected the metaphysical schemes, and it had a huge concern for social issues. So, all these ideas, that is, knowledge is temporary and the concern for social issues. So, all these ideas of pragmatism found a place in postmodernism. And one of the famous neo-pragmatists, Richard Rorty, an American philosopher, he was also closely identified with the postmodern movement. Now, the second philosophic movement that influenced postmodernism, and that is existentialism. So, existentialism is actually a moment at which an individual questions if his or her life has any meaning, purpose, or value to it. So, mostly depression and negative speculations on the purpose of life. So, these are the themes of existentialism. And most of the works of the latter half of the 20th century were highly existential in nature. And one of the most famous existential work is the 1942 essay, The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. It is a very interesting essay that brings about the existential crisis and absurdism to the mainstream literary scenario. And several approaches to absurdity of life was also looked upon in this essay by Albert Camus. So these are the key aspects that concern the postmodernism in American literature. So we have seen how postmodernism arose as a reaction against modernism, and from there how it rejected all of the modern ideas, how it arose against the influence of science and technology, how it tried to conform to the classical and traditional forms in literature. Then we saw some of the important postmodernists and their beliefs. And finally, we also saw the two most important philosophical movements that influence postmodernism in American literature. So we have come to the end of this session. Thank you for watching this video. And if you have any doubts or comments, please share them in the comment section below. Thank you.